They had money, freedom, and a future everyone dreamed about. Then one trusted door closed, and everything disappeared, except the one thing that mattered most. In a city of glass towers and warm night lights, two best friends lived like they had unlocked a secret door. Their names were Ethan Cole and Mason Reed. They met in a small college lab. They were broke then. They shared one laptop, one cheap pizza, and one big promise: we rise together. Years later the promise looked real. Their mornings started late, their meetings started early, and their bank apps looked like video games. They had money, they had freedom, they had success, and it did not feel heavy, it felt clean, because they worked for it. Ethan loved strategy. He liked whiteboards and long plans. Mason loved motion. He liked calls and quick decisions. Together they were a strong engine. They built a chain of small businesses, one marketing studio, one software service, one logistics office, and a few quiet investments. They opened offices across town. Each office had a simple sign. Each team had a clear goal. And the culture was kind. They did not scream. They did not brag. They just moved. In the evenings they spoke about the future, not like dreamers, like builders. They talked about digital assets and new finance tools. They studied charts, they learned risk, they learned patience, and they learned timing. Soon they had a crypto desk inside one of their offices. Nothing shady, just research, long-term positions, and careful rules. They had advisors, lawyers, accountants, and mentors. They did it the slow way. And the slow way worked. The media noticed, friends from the old days noticed, and strangers began to ask for meetings. Ethan and Mason kept one rule: we do not sell our friendship, we do not gamble our trust, we do not rush because others rush. Their lives looked bright, but they still ate at the same diner on Sundays, they still ran at the river, and they still argued about movies, small things, safe things, because the big things were already handled, and for a while it stayed that way. They traveled for conferences, not to show off, but to learn. They sat in front rows, they took notes, they asked simple questions, and they listened to answers that felt uncomfortable. Ethan saved every lesson in a folder. Mason saved every lesson in people. He remembered names, birthdays, and the small clues in a handshake. Their teams trusted them, because they showed up, they paid on time, they gave credit, and they were calm in storms. When a project failed they did not look for a villain. They looked for the cause, then they fixed the process. They hosted small dinners for their managers, no loud music, no wild stories, just calm talks and honest feedback. They also supported local programs, training for young founders, scholarships, and community tech nights. It was not charity as a headline, it was gratitude in action. At home Ethan had a clean apartment with books and a single guitar he rarely played. Mason had a loft with plants and a dog named Sunny, and when one of them felt tired they would meet on the roof, look at the city, and say the same line: we are still those kids with one laptop. And that line kept them steady, because success can make people forget where their feet are, but they kept their feet on the same ground. And in that steady season, a new name returned to their circle, a familiar smile from an old networking event, a guy who looked harmless, and who spoke as if he already knew the next decade. His name was Calvin Brooks, and he asked for coffee, just coffee, nothing more. Calvin Brooks arrived with perfect timing and a relaxed laugh. He said he had been watching their rise from a distance. He said he respected how they treated people, and that kind of praise can feel like warm sunlight. Ethan smiled but stayed cautious. Mason smiled and leaned in. Calvin spoke in simple sentences. He did not use big words. He used stories. He talked about a new partner group, a private circle of investors, people who moved capital like a river, smooth and quiet. He said they were building a bridge between traditional markets and digital assets, and he said the bridge needed operators who understood both worlds. He pointed at Ethan and Mason like he was naming captains. Ethan asked for details. Calvin gave enough to sound real, numbers that were not too huge, timelines that were not too fast. He mentioned compliance, he mentioned audits, he mentioned boring things, and boring things can feel safe. Mason asked who else was involved. Calvin dropped names of people they had heard of, not celebrities, just respected professionals. He said he could arrange introductions. He said the circle did not like noise, they liked discipline, and he liked that Ethan and Mason were disciplined. The coffee ended, and Calvin did not push. He stood up, paid the bill, and said, "Think about it, I will send a packet." That night Ethan read the packet twice. It looked clean, graphs, legal notes, risk sections, and a clear promise of slow growth. Mason called two friends to ask about Calvin. Both said he was connected, not close, but connected, no red flags, just a man who moved around. The next week Calvin invited them to a small office downtown. The office was modest, a few desks, a quiet receptionist, and framed certificates on the wall. Calvin introduced them to a calm woman named Nora Hale. She spoke like a lawyer, careful and precise. She explained the structure. It was a fund gateway. They would place a portion of their liquid capital into a managed strategy, a blend of stable assets and select crypto positions. The strategy used custody services, and it claimed multiple sign-offs. It sounded like safety built into the design. Ethan asked about withdrawal windows. Nora answered without blinking. Mason asked about fees. She answered again. Every answer was smooth, and smooth answers can hide sharp edges. Still Ethan could not find the edge. He requested time. Calvin nodded. Again no pressure. He walked them out and said, "Whatever you choose, respect." And that word respect can lower a guard. For 2 weeks they debated, they ran scenarios, they checked documents, they asked their accountant. Nothing looked wrong, and the opportunity looked like a smart move, not a leap, so they chose a small test, just a slice, just enough to measure the system. The test month passed with calm reports, weekly statements, small gains, no drama. The money came back on time when they requested a partial pull, and that single smooth withdrawal acted like a stamp of trust. Calvin congratulated them, not loudly, just a short message, solid execution. Mason felt excitement, Ethan felt relief. Their advisors said it appeared legitimate. And legitimacy is often a feeling built from little proofs. Calvin then suggested a larger allocation, not all, never all, he said, but enough to matter, enough to unlock better terms, and he offered them a seat closer to the decision table, a chance to see deal flow before the crowd. The door looked open, and it looked safe. After that first clean month they moved with more confidence, still careful, still within rules, but larger. They transferred funds from several businesses, they reorganized cash reserves, and they treated it like a professional allocation. Ethan created a dashboard. Mason briefed their managers. The idea was simple: let the core companies run, let the capital work on the side. Calvin kept in touch. He sent short updates. He invited them to 2 dinners with other investors. The dinners were quiet and classy, no wild talk, just calm people speaking about risk and patience. Ethan noticed how everyone echoed the same phrases: measured, disciplined, long horizon. It sounded wise, but it also sounded rehearsed. Mason said it was just culture, a shared language, and maybe it was. Over the next weeks the statements showed growth again, nothing crazy, just steady, and steady made it feel more real. Then Calvin asked for one change, a new custody partner. He said the old partner was updating systems, temporary maintenance. He said it would reduce fees and improve settlement times. Nora Hale sent an addendum. It looked official. Ethan read it carefully. The names were slightly different, but not different enough to scream danger. Their accountant said it seemed fine, and because the first step had worked, the second step felt like a routine adjustment. They agreed. The new process required a new portal login, a new verification step, and a small transfer to confirm the channel. The transfer returned quickly, like before, another stamp of trust. Mason laughed and said, "See, easy." Ethan still felt a faint tension, like a tiny stone in a shoe, but the road was smooth and he did not want to stop the walk. Their business life stayed busy, staff hired, new clients signed, new offices planned, and the fund reports kept arriving. Then one Friday the report arrived late, just a few hours. Calvin said it was a reporting lag, nothing more. The next week it was late again. Calvin apologized, then he sent a longer note filled with polite words: system migration, reconciliation. Ethan asked Nora directly. She answered with the same calm tone. Mason wanted to trust, because distrust feels like an insult to the past month, so they waited, and waiting can become a habit. Then the portal displayed a new message: enhanced security review, and that message asked them to re-verify identity. Not unusual, but the link looked odd. Ethan did not click. He called Calvin. Calvin answered fast. He sounded relaxed. He said it was normal, just part of the upgrade, and he said, "You are protected." Mason clicked while Ethan watched. Nothing happened at first. Then the portal refreshed. Their dashboard still showed balances, and the numbers still looked fine. The stone in Ethan's shoe became heavier. he asked for a small withdrawal, just a test. The request stayed pending, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Calvin said banks were slow, then he said the compliance team was busy, and every new excuse was wrapped in friendly voice, the kind of voice that makes you doubt your own doubt. On day 4 Ethan stopped being polite. He called their lawyer, he called their bank, he asked for transaction proofs, he printed every email, every statement, every signature page. Mason watched him and felt a cold drop in his stomach, because Ethan only moved like that when a fire was near. They drove to the downtown office. The receptionist's desk was empty, the lights were on but dim, a sign on the door said closed for maintenance. Ethan knocked, no answer. Mason tried the handle, locked. They waited, then a janitor passed and said nobody had been there all week. That single sentence turned the air thin. They called Calvin again, voicemail. They emailed Nora Hale, no reply. The portal still showed balances, still calm, still smiling, but the calm now looked like paint over a crack. Ethan searched corporate registries, he searched service providers, he searched the custody partner name, he found fragments, addresses that led to mailboxes, company names that existed but did not match the documents. It was not one obvious lie, it was a web of small mismatches, and small mismatches can hide a big absence. Mason reached out to a person from the dinner, a man named Victor Lane. Victor replied with one line, "I thought you knew them better than I did." Then Victor stopped answering. Another investor wrote back with panic, "My withdrawal is pending too." The next morning the portal went down, a plain error page. No login, no balances, just silence. Mason felt his hands shake. He opened their business accounts, he checked the transfers, the money had left weeks ago, and now it was not returning. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, eyes fixed on a single spreadsheet, the one that tracked cash flow. He did not speak for a long time, then he said, "We need to assume it is gone, we need to protect the companies." Mason wanted to argue, to say no, to say there must be a fix, a call, a button, something. But he saw the calm in Ethan, a different calm, a survival calm. They met their leadership team that day. They did not share every detail, but they prepared. They froze expansion plans, they paused new hires, they tightened budgets, they moved remaining reserves to safer accounts, they asked their auditor to run a full review. By night the truth kept unfolding, a false address here, a fake phone number there, a contract clause that pointed to arbitration in a place that did not exist. Ethan realized the early smooth withdrawal had been bait, money returned to build trust. Then the larger pool was taken. Mason stared at the ceiling and whispered, "Calvin, why?" As if the word why could pull the answer out of the dark. And the hardest part was not only the loss, it was the shame, because shame makes you feel alone, even when your best friend sits beside you. Yet Ethan did sit beside him, and he did not accuse, he did not say "I told you so," he just said, "We will face it together, like we always said." They filed reports with their attorneys, they contacted financial compliance offices, they gathered evidence in folders, not for revenge, but for clarity, and for any chance to recover a fraction. The process was slow and formal, and while forms were filled, their real life kept moving, bills, payroll, leases, and obligations. The clock did not care about their shock. The next weeks were a test of gravity, because money is not only money, it is oxygen for operations. Their companies could breathe for a while, but not forever. Clients sensed tension, competitors offered lower bids, and some partners paused decisions, not because they hated Ethan and Mason, but because uncertainty spreads like fog. Ethan worked through nights, he renegotiated leases, he called vendors, he asked for patience, he offered transparency. Mason met every team lead in person, he listened, he answered questions with steady voice, and he promised to protect jobs as long as possible. They cut their own salaries to almost nothing, they sold personal luxuries, watches, cars, art, anything that could become runway, but the missing capital was a deep hole, and every week the hole pulled more into it. Their marketing studio survived on contracts, but the software service needed cash for development. The logistics office needed insurance renewals and fleet payments, one by one. They chose what to save, and what to let go, and every choice felt like cutting a thread that had taken years to weave. They sold 2 offices, they merged teams, they ended side projects, they said goodbye to a few businesses that had once been their pride. Some employees cried, some were angry, some understood. Ethan and Mason stood in front of them and took the blame without excuses, because leadership without blame is just decoration. The legal process moved slowly, they received formal letters, deadlines, and case numbers, and most days there was no news, only waiting, and waiting can be louder than bad news. One evening Mason sat in the old diner alone, the same booth as always. He looked at the menu and realized he could afford it, but it felt different now. He did not want the food, he wanted the feeling of before. Ethan arrived and slid into the booth. He placed 2 cups of coffee on the table. He said, "I ran the numbers, we can keep one core company alive if we downsize. Hard, we can keep our reputation if we stay honest." Mason nodded, his eyes were wet but he did not wipe them fast. He let the moment be real. He said, "I keep thinking I should have seen it, I should have slowed down, I should have listened to your stone in the shoe." Ethan shook his head. He said, "I also signed, I also trusted, we both did, and we both learn, but we do not break." Mason laughed once, a small dry laugh. He said, "People will talk, they will say we got lucky then got foolish." Ethan said, "Let them talk, we will build again, maybe smaller, maybe slower, but cleaner." And in that booth, with simple coffee, they made a new promise, not about rising, but about staying human, no matter what the numbers say. Outside the diner the city still shined, but their world had changed, and the shine no longer tempted them, it only reminded them to be careful. They moved out of their bigger places. Ethan packed books into plain boxes, Mason gave Sonny the dog more walks to calm himself. They shared a smaller workspace, 1 room, 2 desks, and a whiteboard, the same shape as the old days, and that symmetry felt like a quiet lesson. Months passed and the noise faded into routine. Lawyers sent updates, auditors sent reports, and most lines ended with the same phrase, limited recovery. Ethan and Mason learned to breathe with that phrase. They stopped refreshing inboxes every hour, they started focusing on what they could touch. They rebuilt habits, early runs, clean meals, hard work, and honest conversations. Still the name Calvin Brooks stayed like a shadow in the corner of their minds, not as a monster, just as a question mark. One weekend Ethan drove to a conference in a nearby city, not to pitch, just to observe. He listened to panels about security, custody, and trust, and he realized how easy it is to look professional, how easy it is to borrow the costume of legitimacy. Mason spent his time calling old contacts, not begging, just reconnecting. Some doors stayed closed, some opened a crack, and one old contact, a quiet analyst named Jordan Pike, shared something helpful. He said he had seen similar patterns, similar documents, similar portal designs. Jordan introduced them to a private investigator, a careful woman named Elise Warren. Elise did not promise miracles, she promised facts. They gave her every file, every email, every screenshot. Elise traced trails, corporate shells, old phone records, and domain registrations. Her findings were simple and hard. Calvin Brooks was not one person. It was an identity used by a small group, and the group moved from city to city. Nora Hale was likely an actress or a paid front. The downtown office was rented for a short window, the certificates were printed props, and the dinners were staged to create social proof. When Ethan heard that, he felt anger rise, but it cooled quickly, because anger without a target becomes acid inside you. Mason asked, "Can we find them?" Elise said, "Maybe, but the path is long and uncertain." She explained jurisdictions, paperwork, and the reality that stolen funds can be split and scattered fast. Ethan thanked her. He paid her, and he asked for one thing: "If you find a door, tell us, but do not let this consume us." Mason struggled with that. He wanted justice, he wanted a moment where Calvin looked ashamed, a moment where a truth was spoken out loud. Then he looked at Ethan, tired but steady, and he understood. Closure is a luxury, and peace is a choice. That night they talked on the roof of their small workspace building. The wind was cold. The city lights were the same as before. Mason said, "Do you ever blame me, because I was the one who leaned in, I was the one who clicked?" Ethan looked at him and said, "I blame the decision, not the friend. We made it together, and we carry it together." Mason breathed out slowly. He said, "Okay, then I will stop chasing shadows, I will chase skills, I will chase real value." Ethan nodded. He said, "Tomorrow we start again, one client, one contract, one clean brick at a time." And they smiled. Not because it was easy, but because their friendship had survived the sharpest test, and that was worth more than any chart on a screen. They began with what they still had, their minds, their names, and a few loyal clients who believed in their character. Ethan designed a new service, risk reviews for small companies, treasury management, basic security processes, and clear reporting. Mason designed the front door, partnerships, speaking events, and relationship rebuilding. They did not hide their story, they did not overshare either, they chose a clean line. We took a loss, we learned, we changed our systems, and we are here. To help others avoid the same trap, some people respected that honesty, some people smirked, but the smirks mattered less over time. They hosted free workshops at community centers, simple lessons about finance hygiene, checking custodians, verifying entities, reading clauses. They used plain language, no hype, no fear, just clarity, and slowly their calendar filled. One startup hired them to review vendor contracts, another hired them to set up multi-approval payments, another hired them to design incident drills. None of these jobs made them rich, but each job made them useful, and usefulness brought confidence back. They also rebuilt their own internal rules. Ethan created a policy called 2 eyes, every major decision needed 2 independent checks. Mason created a rule called slow yes, if something felt urgent, they would wait 1 extra day, because urgency is often a mask. Their small workspace became a calm lab again. A whiteboard, a printer, a coffee machine, and a wall of sticky notes. Sonny the dog slept under Mason's desk and raised his head when someone new walked in. One day a young founder named Lily Grant came for advice. She was nervous and bright. She said she was being offered a fast opportunity. Ethan asked for documents. Mason asked for context. Together they found gaps in the story, not proof of harm, but enough to pause. Lily listened, she slowed down, and weeks later she returned. She said, "You saved me from a bad deal, thank you." That moment landed deep, because it turned their pain into protection for someone else. They started a simple newsletter, weekly notes, 1 lesson, 1 checklist, 1 small story, and a reminder to breathe before you sign. The newsletter spread quietly, founders shared it, accountants shared it, and even a few investors subscribed. Their reputation began to shift, not back to the old shine, but to a new kind of respect. The respect of people who have been tested. Then an old client from their marketing studio called. He said, "I miss your team, I miss your standards, can you handle a project?" They said yes. They delivered on time, they delivered clean work, and the client referred another. The income stabilized, the panic faded, and the future returned in small steps, not as a parade, as a path. Ethan and Mason still ate at the Sunday diner, and now the booth felt warm again, not because life was back to normal, but because they had built a new normal, one that did not depend on big numbers, only on real trust. A year after the fall, Elise Warren called with an update. Her voice was calm. She said a related case had opened. Another group in another state reported the same structure, similar documents, similar names, and a few accounts were flagged. She said there might be a recovery pool, small, uncertain, but real. Ethan thanked her and asked what they needed to do: forms, timelines, proof of loss, and patience, always patience. Mason felt a spark of hope, not greed, just relief, because even a small return could close some wounds. They submitted everything again, they signed affidavits, they waited, and while they waited, a new temptation arrived. A different acquaintance offered a shortcut, a high-yield product, a fast lane to regain what they lost. The pitch sounded smooth, the graphs looked shiny, and the timing felt almost poetic, as if the universe was offering a redo. Mason listened for a moment, then he felt the old stone in the shoe. He looked at Ethan. Ethan did not even lean forward. He simply asked, "Who is the custodian? Where is the regulator filing? What are the audited statements?" The acquaintance joked, "You are too cautious now, you used to be bold." Mason smiled and said, "We are still bold, we are bold enough to say no." They walked away, and the no felt like strength. Weeks later a letter arrived from a trustee handling one of the frozen accounts. The letter was formal. It offered a partial distribution, not a rescue, not a refund, just a fraction. Ethan read the number twice. Mason read it 3 times. It was not life-changing, but it was proof that the story was not only loss, there was also a thin thread of return. They used the recovered funds carefully, they paid outstanding vendor balances, they rebuilt a small emergency reserve, and they set aside a portion to support the workshops they ran, because the workshops had become their quiet mission. Then something unexpected happened. Victor Lane, the man from the dinner, reached out. He asked to meet. Ethan and Mason debated. Trust was fragile, but curiosity can be healthy. They met in a public cafe, bright and open. Victor looked tired. He said he had been embarrassed. He said he had introduced friends to Calvin, and they got hurt too. He said he wanted to make it right. He shared details he had kept, a phone number, a timeline, a photo from one dinner where a face in the background was clearer. It was not a dramatic reveal, but it was useful, and it showed remorse. Mason accepted it. Without warmth and without hostility, he said, "Thank you for coming clean, do that with everyone you can." Ethan shook Victor's hand and said, "If you want to repair your name, do it with actions, not speeches." As they walked out, Mason felt lighter, not because justice had arrived, but because accountability had touched the world again, even in a small way, and small repairs matter. They remind you that trust can be rebuilt, not quickly, but truly. That night they wrote a new line on the whiteboard: protect the process, protect the people, and they left it there like a compass, because the biggest lesson was not about crypto or finance, it was about character under pressure. By the second year their small consultancy had a real rhythm: 3 employees, then 5, then 8, all people they trusted, all people who valued calm work. They rented a slightly larger space, still modest, still simple. Ethan built training materials, Mason built client care, and Sonny the dog became the unofficial greeter. One morning an email arrived from a respected firm, a regional bank advisory arm. They wanted Ethan and Mason to help design a client education program. The project was not flashy, but it was credible, and credibility was the new gold. They delivered the program, the bank liked it, and the bank invited them to collaborate again. Then the firm offered something bigger, a partnership contract, stable revenue, and access to a wider client base. Mason felt the old excitement, Ethan felt the old caution. They did not say yes quickly, they did due diligence like it was a ritual. They checked everything: roles, responsibilities, exit clauses, and reputational risk. They asked uncomfortable questions, and the firm answered without defense. That difference mattered. They signed, and the work expanded, not like a rocket, like a steady elevator. With stable income they could breathe. They increased salaries, they rebuilt benefits, they created a small scholarship in the name of their old program, and they invited young founders to apply. The scholarship was not huge, but it carried a message: learn slow, build real. One evening Mason found a photo on his phone from the old days, him and Ethan in the college lab, one laptop, 2 tired smiles. He showed it to Ethan. Ethan laughed and said, "We did not know anything." Mason said, "We still do not know everything." Ethan nodded, and that humility was the new foundation. They also changed how they talked about success. They stopped saying, "We want more." They started saying, "We want stronger systems, stronger relationships, stronger personal discipline," because more without strength is just a bigger fall. At a conference Mason was asked a simple question: what kept you together when everything went wrong? Mason looked at Ethan, then he answered, "We never made the money the third person in our friendship, we kept it outside the room." Some people clapped, some looked away, but a few came after and said, "I needed to hear that." Later that night Ethan and Mason walked through the city, the lights, the cold air, the quiet streets. Mason said, "Do you ever miss the old scale, the many offices, the headlines?" Ethan said, "Sometimes, but I do not miss the fear of losing it, because now I know what matters." Mason smiled. He said, "I guess losing everything taught us to keep the right things." Ethan said, "We did not lose everything, we kept the rarest asset, we kept trust." And in that sentence the whole journey felt clear: the rise, the fall, and the rebuild, all of it was just a frame. The real picture was 2 friends choosing loyalty over ego, again and again, until it became their true wealth. Years later people who met them for the first time assumed they had always been steady. They saw a clean company, a clear service, and leaders who spoke with calm confidence. They did not see the nights of fear, but Ethan and Mason remembered. They remembered the portal going silent, the office door locked, the spreadsheets like cold mirrors, and they remembered the moment in the diner when they chose each other over blame. The Calvin Brooks case never turned into a movie ending. There was no dramatic scene, no perfect apology, no neat bow. There were only documents, partial recoveries, and the slow work of moving forward. And that is how most real stories end, not with fireworks, with habits. Ethan married his longtime partner and kept his life simple, Mason adopted another dog for Sunny to have a friend. They still met every Sunday, same diner, same booth, and sometimes they talked about business. But mostly they talked about life, they laughed about old mistakes, they shared new ideas, and they checked on each other like brothers. One day Lily Grant, the young founder they had helped, sent them a message. She said her company was growing, and she wanted to sponsor their workshops so more people could attend for free. Ethan showed the message to Mason. Mason read it slowly, then he said, "This is the return I care about." Ethan nodded. They expanded the workshops into a small program, a traveling series. Different cities, different rooms, always the same simple theme. Verify, slow down, protect your people, and do not confuse confidence with speed. At the end of each workshop Mason would tell one short story. He would say, "We had money, freedom, success, and many offices, then we trusted the wrong door, and the door took almost everything, but it did not take our friendship." And when he said that, he never used heavy words, he never used hate, he used responsibility. Because responsibility is the bridge back to dignity. Ethan would add one line. He would say, "Your best safety system is not software, it is character." People would leave quieter than they arrived, not scared, just awake. After one event a young man asked, "If you could go back, would you do it all again?" Mason looked at Ethan looked at Mason, and Ethan said, "I would change the decision, but I would not change the friendship." Mason smiled and said, "Same." They walked outside into the evening, the air cool and clear, and the city lights blinked like patient stars. They did not feel rich in the old way, they felt rich in the true way, steady work, honest sleep, and a friend who stays. And if someone listening to this story is holding pressure, chasing speed, chasing a quick win, let this be a gentle sign. Slow down, check twice, ask hard questions, and keep your real friends close, because money can vanish fast, but trust, if you protect it, can carry you through any reset. And that is how Ethan Cole and Mason Reed kept going, together. The end is not the fall, the end is the choice you make after the fall, and they chose to build, to learn, and to stay loyal.